This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with their most important stakeholders in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Thalyana Stathis to the show today. Dr. Stathis is the career advisor for postdocs and Ph.D. students at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. She supports hundreds of students and postdocs in each stage of their career planning, and she directs workshops for career exploration and navigating the job market for all academic and non-academic career paths. Prior to her role at Memorial Sloan Kettering, she served as assistant dean at Columbia University's graduate school and worked at Springer Nature as a journal editor. Thalyana received her Ph.D. from Yale University in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. Welcome to the show, Thalyana.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for hosting me on your podcast. I'm really honored to be a guest. And I just wanted to say you have quite an impressive list of people that you have interviewed. So I'm really excited to be one of those people here with you today.
Thank you for that kindness. And you are joining that list. I want to actually start asking you about that or outside of academia, which the first one being your involvement in dance, including ballet and Greek dance during your undergraduate studies at Cornell, and also while earning your PhD at Yale. As many of our listeners know, there's an artistry to science. I like to say the etymology of scientist actually incorporates the word artist intentionally. That's how scientist, the word was created. And as a scientist, do you think sometimes that an artist mindset, however you'd like to define what an artist mindset is, but do you think that an artist can help inform researchers' approach to doing science in positive ways?
Yeah, so I really love this question that you have asked. I appreciate that you had looked up my LinkedIn profile and had researched it so carefully, because I did put some notes there, some more personal things about myself, not just me as a researcher. I did add some things there about how I've been very involved in different types of dance, Greek dance, because my family is Greek, and I've been doing ballet for many years since I was a little girl and still doing it now. So I would say never a professional dancer or anything like that, but that was always one of the main extracurricular activities that was very important to me, these different types of dance. And so I appreciate that you had noticed that on my LinkedIn profile, because I think those are some fun things about myself, in addition to my Greek heritage. And I enjoyed sharing with you the origin of my name as well, where it comes from in ancient Greek mythology. So yeah, like I was saying before, I do really appreciate your question about how the artistic mindset could perhaps influence the scientific side of things and perhaps some crosstalk there. In all honesty, I felt like I had always kept those two worlds separate. My artistic side, all of the knowledge that I had acquired and the skills I had gained over the years about gaining more expertise in different types of dance, that was just always a part of me that I enjoyed doing outside of the lab. And then I was inside the lab, and then I was a researcher, and then I had my scientist hat on, and I was using that part of my brain. And so in complete honesty, I always had those two very important parts of my life. I never really thought about if they had influenced one another. But what I can say is that I felt that the passions that I had outside of the lab and outside of being a researcher just really helped me feel more fulfilled and perhaps prevented me from being too overwhelmed inside the lab. And during some difficult times getting through my Ph.D., I felt like having that outlet outside of the lab and being very involved in other things and gaining expertise in other things really helped give me some perspective and keep a clear mind. So maybe in that more general sense, that clarity of thought, that taking some time outside of the lab to pursue other interests and then going back to my work, perhaps that did end up helping my work in some way. And I can tell you that I did find myself in graduate school when I was reading many papers about my field of research. I also found myself once in a while just looking up some papers out of interest about people who were maybe studying exercise science and were studying dancers and their form. And just out of curiosity to see, I think I have an understanding of why it's good to stretch this way or that, but maybe I'll read a paper on it too. So in that sense, there was some crosstalk from the science going to the to the artistic side.
Yeah, and thanks for underlining a little different way of looking at this question, which really, as you pointed out, relates to giving yourself a bit of a break and not having to focus intently at the lab or when you're trying to get through some challenges at the bench or in the library or any kind of professional environment, to give yourself that opportunity to do something also that's very physical but is also separate from what you're doing. So giving your brain a break, as you talked about. I also want to ask you about something that you've done in the verbal communication space. You joined Toastmasters in New York City more than 2.5 years ago, as you point out. And I'd love you to talk about what motivated you to join, how it's helped you communicate, things like that, and also why you encourage researchers at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to do the same, to consider joining Toastmasters.
Yeah, this is a funny story about why and when and how I joined. It started with my husband actually has been a member of Toastmasters for a number of years, and I was just always casually aware that he was doing it. That was his big passion outside of work, to be involved in Toastmasters. And I'll just say for the audience that Toastmasters is a nonprofit organization that has been around, I think, since the 1940s or 1950s. It's been around for a really long time. And it's international. So there are chapters literally all over the world. And I'm based in New York City. There are many chapters here and in every city across the country, but also all over the world, wherever you're based. And it's all volunteer based, where the chapters are formed by professionals who want to improve their public speaking skills and general communication skills. That's the main goal of Toastmasters, is just to help people in any profession, any background, improve general communication skills. Also, perhaps to improve communication skills related to the work that they do, because sometimes there are Toastmasters chapters affiliated with a company. And sometimes your colleagues might be in a same Toastmasters club. If perhaps their boss was encouraging them to join an organization, the company just forms their own Toastmasters club to make it easier that way. But usually it's for professionals outside of whatever field you're in, professionals outside of that field, and just a random stranger you might meet on the street could end up being in a Toastmasters club. And you work with them, you all have a common goal of improving your public speaking skills and communication skills. So that was the attraction that my husband had to join Toastmasters. He wanted to improve his public speaking skills, but also when he was having meetings at work, he wanted to improve when he was giving presentations. And so I really noticed that he made quite a change by joining this organization. And I casually thought maybe at some point I should join it too. And in terms of the when, I decided to join in February 2020. There was one in-person meeting I went to, and then from then on, and still now, it was virtual. Starting in March 2020, the next meeting I had gone to was virtual. And that particular club based in New York City is called Traffic Toastmasters. If anyone is interested in joining, have to give them a plug because it's such an awesome club.
Sure, yeah. And we'll have a link to it in the show notes for this episode.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, they would definitely appreciate that. They're always looking for new members. But yeah, essentially, I had joined Traffic Toastmasters. It's one of the oldest clubs based in New York City. And it had essentially been virtual since March 2020. I have to be honest in saying I had a baby last year. And as soon as that happened, my free time to still participate in Toastmasters went from 100% to basically zero once I had a baby. But up until then, up until late 2021, I was very actively involved. And I'm still involved now, just not in as much of an active capacity, but I'm going to definitely go back to it more when I have some more free time in my personal life. But essentially, I found that it was super helpful for me to get through the pandemic, first of all. And I find that because a lot of situations that were once in person are now virtual, we've been keeping some of those elements, even though it's now been 2.5 years of the pandemic and more things are in person. There are still many things that are virtual. Just as a side note, some of the work that I do with students and postdocs at MSK, I help them prepare for interviews, and there are just more virtual interviews now than there used to be. Certainly many companies are still have gone back to doing things in person, but for the most part, a lot of interviews are still virtual. So it's important to develop those virtual public speaking skills and communication skills. And Toastmasters really helped me do that from the start of the pandemic through now. I was not a fan of Zoom. There was a constant frustration, but this group helped me get used to it and become familiar with it and become an expert with it and just be very comfortable speaking in a virtual setting. When the club goes back to being in person, it will be the same elements of that practicing public speaking skills, but now in person. So that was the timing for when I had joined. When I was very active in 2020 and 2021, I had made some posts on LinkedIn talking about how beneficial the club had been for me during this time. And I was encouraging all of the students and postdocs that I work with, and also everybody who follows me on LinkedIn from other institutions across the country. I was encouraging all of the students and postdocs specifically to take the time to consider joining this club, because I find that if you are only focused on talking to other people in the lab or just other scientists, you lose perspective of just how to have a conversation with really anybody else about your research. And Toastmasters is just the ultimate way to have maybe 10 people that you could have just randomly met on the street or at some dinner party, like a friend of a friend, 10 people who are not scientists, but they're very curious to hear about what you do. And they will help you improve talking about your work or really whatever you want to talk about. But I think it's a perfect audience for students and postdocs to practice talking about their research to a more general audience instead of just thinking about talking with other lab members, other people in other departments or other scientists in general. So it's a great way to politely force yourself to be in front of an audience of people where you can really figure out how to speak about your research in a more general way that you just may not otherwise have an opportunity to do so if you don't have a lot of close friends who aren't scientists, and they wouldn't bother at working with you to practice your communication skills that way. I wanted to briefly mention that some of the key things Toastmasters can help you with are in terms of timing, using filler words and just general word usage. There are people who have assigned roles during each meeting. Somebody is a timekeeper, somebody is an counter, or somebody who counts all of the filler words, and then somebody is a grammarian. So they basically comment on the language that you've used. And if there were maybe better words you could have chosen. So just a pitch for students and postdocs, I find that they worry about the timing of things when they're trying to explain their work to somebody else, that they might go on and on about the research project and lose people's interest. So Toastmasters really helps you to figure out, how can I talk this particular topic for 2 minutes? And it's still an informative experience, and then move on. And I know it's hard to not use filler words. I use them myself, but that there's somebody during the Toastmasters meeting who will point out how many times you use a particular filler word. And just that knowledge can really help you mitigate the usage of filler words over time.
Yes, we all do that. I wonder if you have, based on your Toastmaster experience, any specific tactics that you think are helpful for eliminating filler words. One thing that I do and try to be conscious of is I try to pause for a second. just take a breath on a beat or something like that. And I'm wondering if there are any other tactics or strategies that you've found helpful in that domain.
Yeah. The pause is the Toastmasters gem. So Mark, I love that you use that. And that has certainly worked for me as well. Some people, they might repeat a word instead of using a filler word. They might repeat the previous word that they said. That can sometimes turn into a crutch as well. But if people are just so uncomfortable with the silence and taking a pause, then at least they can repeat the previous word that they said while they're trying to think of the next word that's not a filler word. But yeah, I do think that the pause and just trying to speak a little bit slower than you're used to, it will help you really notice the words that you're saying and that are coming out of your mouth a little bit more closely than if you were talking super fast and you're just trying to talk and say many words and some filler words fill in. But if you just speak a little bit slower than you're used to, then you can really, as you're talking, you can pick up the filler words.
Really helpful. And I want to shift now from the spoken word to the written word, because in addition to all this expertise and experience that you have when it comes to communicating orally, you also have extensive experience as a journal editor in your current role. Actually, you help postdocs distill longer passages into concise ones, and trying to determine which information to include and which information doesn't need to be part of a particular, maybe it's an abstract or during a job interview description of the work that you did. These are all choices that can be difficult to make, particularly when you are so immersed in the subject matter. So thinking about your approach to editing, are there specific principles or rules? We talked about maybe the pause when it comes to talking, but now when you're thinking about writing, other kind of approaches that have helped you in the editing process, both within your own work and also as you're helping students and postdocs?
Definitely. Thanks for that question. I'll just note that I used to be a journal editor. That was the first job I had after my Ph.D. That work was more focused on evaluating manuscripts that came into all of the journals that I was working on and deciding if they should go through the peer review process and then ultimately get accepted for publication by that particular journal, or if they should maybe be considered for another journal based on the interest and scope of that journal. So there are many other editors who also work on the text itself and editing it and distilling it. I didn't have that particular role in my job previously, but in my job now at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I work with students and postdocs and advise them in a number of different ways, one aspect of the advising that I do is to help them with writing about their research. I have to say that when I was writing about my own research, I had a lot of help. I wrote a review with my PI. I wrote a couple of papers. I would say that it was me and one or two other postdocs who were doing a majority of the writing on those papers. We were either both first author or first and second author or co-first author. And there was a lot of support that I got from people who were more senior than me in the lab to help me understand how to write for different audiences, how to write a manuscript for a particular journal audience, and then maybe how to write an abstract or some other summary for either that same audience, but it's a much distilled version of the text. It's only a couple hundred words, which is not an easy task to accomplish. So I got a lot of support from those more senior researchers. And then going to conferences as well. Sometimes you might submit an abstract for that. That's a different audience. So I realized that you have to think about the length and the audience that you're speaking to. Whenever you're working on a piece of writing, you have to ask yourself those two questions first. Sometimes there are guidelines on that for the length. Sometimes you have a good sense of who the audience is going to be, but you really need to figure that out first and then work from there. And so that when I advise students and postdocs now at Memorial Sloan Kettering, I always ask them those types of questions to help them get the juices flowing and think about how they can start writing about their work for different audiences. And usually they can handle the manuscript. It's just any other type of writing is the tricky one. even just the abstract, which distills down what's in the manuscript. And what I noticed is that students and postdocs, they already have some of these tools under their belt. They're very comfortable with preparing slides for different audiences, preparing a slide deck for an upcoming presentation for lab meeting. And then they know that they're going to give a talk at a conference, and that's a different audience. And this conference is all experts in their field, or this conference is all cancer researchers, but not necessarily in their specialty. So they're going to slightly adjust the slides, the amount of background introduction that they give in the beginning, and then maybe talking about 2 projects instead of 3, depending on either the amount of time that they have or the interest that the audience would have. Either it's lab meeting or a conference of experts or non-experts. So students and postdocs are already thinking about these ways to distill information in terms of the audience that they're speaking to and how much the information they should share with them. Essentially, how much can I cover? How many projects? How much introduction, background information should I give? What's going to be most interesting to the audience? And also, what do I want the audience to take away and maybe give me some feedback on? For lab meeting, it's very specific. You want very specific feedback on certain experiments you're doing at that very granular level. What type of feedback do you want from the audience when you are sharing with them information in a conference setting of experts or non-experts? What type of feedback would you want for them that's going to reflect what you end up sharing with them? And so I find students and postdocs are okay with making slides for different talks they're going to give for different audiences. And so oftentimes I tell them, do you have a slide deck that we can reference first? And can we turn that into paragraphs? And so if you have to write an abstract or a page or 2 pages for this audience or that, do you have a slide deck we can start with a similar audience in mind? And then we can work on writing the written text. And that seems to work better for them to use that as a starting point. They get very scared about the pen on the page, and they've never written for this audience before, and it can only be 500 words. But if we use something that's already in their tool belt, it helps them definitely get through that process. My other suggestion for them has been to work with our communications team at Memorial Sloan Kettering or whatever university you're based at. There's a communications team there. They write press releases about your research all the time. Whenever your lab publishes a paper, they write a press release about it. So work with them. If they write a press release about your work with them and say, I'm actually very curious about how you're writing this press release. I'm excited to do the interview and to give you some quotes, but could I also perhaps be involved in the writing process as well and to help write the press release, because I have a really vested interest in developing that type of written communication for that audience. So that's another piece of advice I give students and postdocs.
Excellent. And that's one that you don't often hear people talking about. So Thalyana, thank you so much for underlining that really great nugget of wisdom there. You had, as we referenced earlier, a fascinating career journey. You've done different things, and I would really appreciate if you would share with audiences some of the details of your career trajectory. And then often people struggle at transition points in their career, things that you have learned, lessons that you've learned, things that you've found have helped ease the transition as you've moved from different roles would also, I think, really be instructive and helpful for listeners.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll first just mention my current job at Memorial Sloan Kettering is that I direct our Office of Career and Professional Development, and I work with the Ph.D. students, the graduate students, and the postdocs in all of the labs, all the research labs based in Memorial Sloan Kettering. And so on the career side of things, I'm basically the career advisor. People can attend any of my workshops or seminars to learn about different career paths, and they can also meet with me one-on-one in my office and have a number of consultations. And sometimes I do refer back to the career journey that I went on myself as a PhD student to explore different options. And just like you said, some of those lessons that I learned along the way and how the transition points are really the crucial ones where I was learning specific things and then learning more things in the next transition point. And I do like to share my own journey. Not that the person I'm speaking with is particularly interested in the types of jobs that I had. That's totally fine, but it's just the general lessons that I learned when I was in their shoes and how they can consider different career paths for themselves as a student or postdoc interested in perhaps not necessarily staying in academia forever. Those are usually the people that I work with. If they decide that they may not want to stay in academia and be a researcher in that setting for the long term, then how can they pursue exploring other options instead? Because that's not always clear to them. So I'm the person that they come to make those things a bit clearer. And so what do I usually share with people about my career journey when I'm advising them? What I say is that when I was a PhD student from 2009 to 2014. And so in my first, second, and third years during the PhD, I basically was open to any career path after the PhD that one could potentially pursue. I was open to exploring all of those, learning about all of those, and then checking off the list of that sounds interesting. That doesn't sound interesting. I'm going to keep exploring that. I'm not going to keep exploring that. There were some useful resources at my institution at Yale where there were a number of clubs, career clubs that I was able to join. That was basically a way for me to be with other peers and learn about some different career options. We were helping each other learn about career options, and then also maybe invite some professionals who had gotten a PhD and then were currently in that career, invite them to perhaps have a chat with all of us and with other students who were interested in learning about their career. So there's a lot of the term networking, not to be afraid of it at all. It was hugely beneficial to meet people in a few steps ahead of me who were in this super interesting job and learn about why they enjoyed that as the next step for themselves. And then to think, is that a good option for me? So I joined a number of career clubs, just knowing that there were all these different options available to me that I became familiar with initially through the Science Careers website, my IDP or my individual development plan. It really gave me a nice overview of 20 or 25 options that I could consider for myself. And then I found resources at my university where I could explore those different career options with fellow students and find ways to meet professionals who are in those jobs now. So I did that for 3 years. And then I thought, I'm hoping the PhD is 5 to 6 years long. That's usually how long it takes. So I thought that by my 4th year, I should narrow things down a bit. And so maybe this is one transition point about how it's wonderful. There are so many options available to you. But I also felt that for my own peace of mind, let me choose 2 things that I'm really interested in applying for a job for these 2 things. I can see myself being in this position next after my PhD. This could be my first job after my PhD. So I chose 2 areas where I really thought I could see myself applying for a job in this arena. It was very clear to me. I knew what jobs I could apply for, and they all sounded super interesting. I looked at a bunch of job postings. So that was the first transition where I was able to tell myself by my 4th year, if I'm hoping to graduate around the 5th year or so, I should start narrowing things down a bit and think more specifically about if I were to apply for a job in this area, would I feel comfortable doing so? Or what other skills do I still need to learn in order to get to that point? Or what other people in this field do I still need to meet in order to then feel comfortable applying for the job in the 5th year? And another important lesson is that I was just in the right place at the right time for the first job that I got. And this happens a lot. Life works in funny ways where I was very interested in these 2 types of jobs. I applied for both. I found job descriptions for both. It was basically for the journal editor position or for a position in research administration, more similar to what I'm doing now. I applied for both of those types of jobs, and I got the journal editor job first. So that was what I went with. I was obviously super excited about it, and I was happy that was my first job after the PhD. But a lot of it was a friend of a friend told me about this job posting. I was able to speak with the hiring manager. So all of the timing worked out for this particular job. Everything fell into place kind of very nicely. So it was a perfect transition from finishing my PhD into my first job in the real world, if you will. So the networking helped. the friends of friends really helped to become familiar with specific job postings I was interested in applying to and how to get my resume at the top of the pile. And so that worked out for the editor job. I did that for about a year and a half. I really loved the work. I love reading manuscripts all the time and working with the editors in chief of the journals that I had been assigned to. I loved that experience. And I noticed that towards the end, I had the chance to go to SO conferences and speak with students and postdocs about the publishing process and to have them submit their manuscripts to our journals and to understand that process. So when I was going back to academia, if you will, to give these talks in this conference setting that the journal was sponsoring, I realized that I did miss being in the academic setting. I didn't want to keep doing research and go back to the lab, but I wanted to go back to the academic setting in some capacity and work with students and postdocs more closely than what I was doing in my current journal editor position. I loved the conferences where I got the chance to meet with them. I wanted that to be every day and not just once in a while. So then I went back to applying for more research administration jobs that I had been interested in a couple of years prior. I went back to that. How did it work out? Again, a friend of a friend, where I learned about a particular job opportunity, and it was really being in the right place at the right time. So I don't want people to be scared that like that's the only way I got the job because it was through my network and it was the right place at the right time. Like that's how it happens for many people. And so you shouldn't be upset with yourself that that's how it worked out. You did the hard work of getting to that point. And then whatever you need to do to get your name at the top of the pile to be recognized by the hiring manager, that's what you do. And then it ends up working out really nicely at the end. So that worked for me twice. And then a third time for my current job, my Memorial Sloan Kettering, when I was moving from Columbia to Memorial Sloan Kettering, again, I found out about this opportunity from a former colleague. And once I had heard about it, that's when I realized, almost retrospectively, that's when I realized that I wanted to make that career move. So another transition point from the editor to the research administration, like when I had been exposed to this other opportunity, that's when I realized I wanted to go back to academia. When I had heard about this other job opportunity at Memorial Sloan Kettering, that's when I realized that's really more of the work that I would like to do now. I loved what I was doing at Columbia. I worked in the graduate school. There were a lot of very broad things that I was doing. I was responsible for a number of different aspects of the graduate student experience there. But what I realized was when I heard about managing a career office for graduate students, and I could really focus on that specifically, and there was an opportunity at Memorial Sloan Kettering to do that, that's when I said, I think I'd like to now make that transition as well. So another bit of advice is you might not necessarily have an understanding of what exactly you want to do until you're already on the ground, learning about more opportunities along the way, maybe hearing about other opportunities from colleagues, just like I did about this opportunity at Memorial Sloan Kettering. You can't know about everything from the beginning, but you'll learn more over time. When you're in the job, you'll learn more about what the next step could be once you are there. And then, so just give yourself time to figure it out, and you will learn more once you get the process started. And then you'll continue to hone and focus in on exactly what you would like to pursue, either in your job, if it's possible, or in the next job that you'll be applying to. So to summarize there, I think it's definitely about finding a way to narrow down your options during your PhD or postdoc, and then using your network when you're actually on the job market, and just being okay with those transition points, being open to continuing to learn when you're already in a job, continuing to learn about what the next step could be, because you may not have a complete understanding of that until you're in the job. And that's okay. You figure things out along the way. You learn about more opportunities to grow in your position or more opportunities to apply to another job in another institution or wherever you're based.
Yana, thanks for it's both thematic and specific, your response. I think listeners are definitely going to be able to come away from that with some actionable steps that they can take as they think about their own careers. As we wrap up, I would like to go back to the beginning and ask you a question about science communication, which is, what do you think was the best advice that you received when it comes to communicating your science to general audience?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love that we're wrapping up with this particular one. And I would say that not necessarily advice that was given to me, but I would like to share advice that we do give to students and postdocs at Memorial Sloan Kettering when they want to improve their communication skills. We have an event called the Postdoc Slam. It's similar to the 3-minute thesis, if people have heard of that before, but is essentially for postdocs instead of PhD students to be presenting their research. And the idea is to have one slide and to talk about your research for 3 minutes with the help of that particular slide, and to present your work to your research to a general audience. And so there are a lot of useful tips we give to people who are participating in the postdoc slam that I'd love to share with listeners today. I think maybe in my career, maybe some of these tips were shared with me, but I never really went out of my way to participate in events like this, and I regret doing so. So I hope that people who are listening today, if there is a 3-minute thesis or some kind of version of a postdoc slam at their institution that can participate in, please sign up and do it, because I wish I had done it as a PhD student, but now at least I'm advising people who are signing up to participate at Memorial Sloan Kettering. So some of the advice that we give people is in terms of presenting your work to a general audience. One of the first things you should think about is, what story can I tell? And so I think students and postdocs who are doing research on more of the basic or fundamental biomedical side of things, and it's not clinically relevant or translationally relevant yet, they struggle with, how can I tell a story? How can I make this relatable? But it's all about making the work more tangible, letting people have some kind of image in their mind. You're describing it to them. And so we find that for researchers who are more on the basic or fundamental side of things, and I just have to say that work is extremely important. I was definitely on that side of basic biomedical research in genetics in a model organism. And I loved the work, and it's just as important as if your work is on a particular disease or it's more clinically or translationally relevant. But so if you are in that position, you want to have people have an image in their mind while you're explaining it to them. You just have to choose something that's more relevant, and oftentimes an analogy really helps. So please consider the analogy. And if you were, for example, doing the 3-minute thesis, the analogy should be in your title. It should be the images on your slide should be following this theme of the analogy, and you should be mentioning it throughout your talk. And so that really helps to ground the audience by giving them something like that you're referring to, that they already have an understanding of what that is. There was an example of somebody who was talking about cell transformation, and they talked about Transformers, the movie, and they found a way to make it work. Everybody have at least heard of Transformers, the movie. They didn't know what cell transformation was. Like, the words are similar. They're familiar with the movie. They're thinking about the movie while the person is talking about cell transformation. I thought that was a really good analogy. It doesn't have to be too crazy. It's just something somebody can have an image in their mind when you're describing the work to them. If your work is more translationally or clinically relevant, if you are studying a particular disease or maybe even working with patients, then that should be the story that you tell. Obviously still to keep everything anonymous, but it helps when you're talking about a particular patient or a disease that people are familiar with, and that helps to ground the work as well, and to in the same way to give an image. And then the other thing, besides starting with the analogy and carrying it through the talk that you're giving to the general audience, is to also, I think the psychology of things helps if you understand how people might remember. And I think people remember numbers very well. And so this is also advice I give when people are working on their resume. I say, how can you quantify the accomplishments that you've done? Can you say, I've written 10 first author papers. I've given 10 international talks at international meetings. I've mentored 10 junior scientists in the lab. It helps to quantify, and people remember numbers quite easily. And so if you can also mention some numbers, give some type of quantification, to the work that you're doing as well. That will be something easy for people to remember. So one example was somebody was talking about there are 4 different ways to treat cancer. I'm going to talk about 2 types with you today. And so they would also use their hands when giving the talk and outlining the I'm going to briefly mention that there are 4 ways, but I'm going to tell you about these 2 ways and focus on that. And so people could have this full understanding of the scope of what the person was trying to cover and then zoom in a little bit more as well. They could absolutely remember the 4 and the 2. Maybe not all of the details, but those were things that they could really take away from the talk. So a little bit of the psychology of how people might be able to understand something, giving them something to relate to, and how they might remember something, like using your hands, numbers as an example of things that somebody could easily remember if you were to explain your research to them for a few minutes. And I'll just end. I have to give a shout out to other organizations like the Alan Alda Center for Science Communication based at Stony Brook. Their resources, as well as the New York Academy of Sciences based here in New York City, but they also have a lot of virtual resources for people not based in New York City. And then other opportunities such as the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. I'm aware of people who have participated in all of these programs, and they have gained a lot of really valuable skills from these programs to help them communicate their research to a general audience. So I want to make sure that the audience listening today is aware of those resources as well.
Absolutely. And we'll have links to them too. It's funny, I'm a big fan of the Alda Center for Communicating Science. I actually did a webinar for them a few years ago on how to combat misinformation. Yeah. And I have a collaboration with the New York Academy of Sciences for my online course. So I'm also a fan of the Academy and all the resources that they provide their tens of thousands of members all around the world. So thanks for calling that out.
Yeah. And this goes without saying that I hope everybody who's listening today, that they already are aware of you, Mark, and your resources, but that they would utilize them to their best ability as possible. Because you already have connections to these institutions that I'm mentioning, so they should be very familiar with the work that you provide as well.
Thank you, Dr. Thalyana Stathis, for just a wonderful interview with sharing your own experience and also making it so relevant for listeners on how they can apply some of the approaches and principles that you have used successfully, things that they perhaps haven't thought so much about, and also pointing the way to resources that could be very helpful as folks are thinking about how they can advance their careers. Dr. Stathis, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on When Science.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'd love to hear any feedback from the audience. If they had any questions about things I talk about, you can share my contact information. I'm happy to stay in touch with people. And also, I'm always trying to improve my communication skills too. I'm not the expert of experts here. The Toastmasters trick, if you want to let me know if you thought I was speaking too long or if I used too many filler words, that I want the audience to engage with me and help me improve my communication skills, but also any of the content that I spoke about today. I'm happy to stay in touch about that as well.
Fantastic. And we'll have your contact information in the show notes that accompanies the episode. And it is so true. All of us can improve our communications. I think it's just a journey that we're all on and picking up things along the way. And you've shared so many of the lessons that you've learned and how they can be used by listeners. So thanks so much, Thalyana. This is just wonderful.
Thanks again, Mark.
Listeners, thank you for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.